A few months ago, I decided I'd take the train from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia as part of this filming trip throughout the East Coast. It's a long train ride, so I looked on Atlas Obscura to see if any of the stops along the way were worth stopping at. And one town in particular caught my eye: Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Alright, we got a pretzel factory. I like that. We got a bunch of old cemeteries. Interesting. Wait, the first public crematorium in the United States? Oh, hell yes.
But it's listed as the first public crematorium, which got me even more curious. It couldn't be the first crematorium period in the US, otherwise they wouldn't have used the qualifier.
So I started reading into the story behind this place, and it turns out that that qualifier is really important. But to understand why, we need to hear some context.
This video was sponsored by viewers like you on Patreon. Come with me to the 1800s for a minute. America was getting crowded, especially those big New England cities. And when population density increases, infectious disease rates go up too. And when disease rates increase, death rates are close behind. So 19th century city folk found themselves in a situation where they had to figure out what to do with a bunch of corpses. By far, the majority of Americans preferred burying their dead. Traditionally, they'd be buried in little churchyards, but again, cities were getting crowded, and a cemetery in the middle of a city is using up some prime real estate. So there was the space concern, but then there was the smell. Most folks thought that decomposing bodies might spread disease through invisible vapors called miasmas. They don't, but that was the most popular idea. One of their solutions was to build big, sprawling cemeteries out in the countryside. This turned into a whole movement of rural and lawn cemeteries built across the country. They're the kind of things that you're probably used to seeing today. But people were still worried about the public health aspect of burials, so a couple of intellectuals started wondering if maybe they should bring back cremation. After all, plenty of ancient cultures practiced cremation back in the day. Most famously in the Hindu tradition, but everyone from Romans, Greeks, Aboriginal Australians, indigenous cultures in both North and South America, and some Chinese dynasties used cremation at some time in some way. It wasn't until the Catholic Church came along and said, nope, way too pagan, that cremations were forbidden in Europe. Well, unless you were punishing a witch. By 1800 standards, cremation was looking like a pretty good public health strategy. There wouldn't be miasmas to worry about, and the cities would get less crowded. So, sweet, they said, let's do it. But that presented another problem. You need really high heat to cremate a body. You can't just stick grandma in your home oven and expect to get ashes. Basically, they'd need to engineer new cremation technology in order to make this thing work. And a few Italian scientists came up with some new furnace designs, but it was Lodovico Brunetti that made the one that stuck. Between 1869 and 1870, he ran a total of 6 experiments testing out different styles of ovens, different amounts of woods, and different temperatures. Brunetti started by trying to cremate full corpses, but he couldn't get them completely incinerated. So he tried smaller body parts like knees and thighs before doing more trials on whole bodies again. It kind of reminds me of when people try to cook a whole Thanksgiving turkey and realize halfway through that they probably should have started by mastering barbecue chicken thighs first. Brunetti's final prototype used a brick oven loaded with 70 to 80 kilograms of wood to get temperatures over 1,000 degrees. He reported being able to completely incinerate a corpse in just 4 hours with this design. He debuted his furnace at the Vienna Exposition in 1873 in this display case. Each of those numbered boxes are the results of experiments 1 through 5 before arriving at 6 and the modern cremation device. Now, in this, Brunetti also took a shot at the church with that inscription above the display. I can't read Latin, so this is going to be terrible, but Indocte Vetitum Mens Renovata Petit, which translates to something like, the modern mind attacks the ignorant prohibition, which that is some scathing Latin right there. Brunetti was saying that burial was dead and cremation killed it. So you've got more interest in cremation as a public health measure, and now you finally have the technology to do it. Modern cremation comes to America through Washington, Pennsylvania. In 1876, a local doctor named Francis Lemoyne noticed that a bunch of people were all getting sick with the same symptoms. A handful of the victims even succumbed to whatever this disease was. Lemoyne was convinced he'd found the culprit. Decomposing bodies buried underground were contaminating the drinking water. Luckily, Lemoyne was following the cremation story in Europe and thought that would be a great way to solve his town's problems. So he went to the trustees of the cemetery in town and said, look, this is a public health hazard. I'll front the money to build the crematorium if you just let us build it on cemetery grounds. But the idea of cremation was still so unpopular that the trustees flat out refused to listen to his offer. So he decided instead to build it on his own estate. He started with a simple brick house and a single furnace modeled after Brunetti's design. They did their first cremation in December of that same year, earning them the title of the first crematorium in the United States. Caitlin Doty did a fascinating video all about it, which I'll link up here. She tells it better than I ever could. The crematorium stayed in service for another 25 years and did a total of 41 cremations over its lifetime, including Lemoyne himself. But here's the catch. He died in 1879, and in the summer of 1884, the new owners of his estate closed off the crematorium to the public. It would only serve Washington County. It was very exclusive. You could say that it was the hottest club in town, and that people were dying to get in. Okay, I'll stop. So while the idea of cremation was still taboo to most Americans, there was a demand for it in the United States, and now that the only crematorium in America was closed to the public, anyone who wanted to be cremated would need to start their own thing. But before any new ones were built, people were still sending corpses to Lemoyne's estate thinking it was open, which finally brings us to Lancaster. It's May of 1884, and a group of men from Lancaster formed the Lancaster Cremation and Funeral Reform Society. Their goal was the same as everyone else's: sanitary progress via cremation. Now, when I say society, I'm talking about a real who's who of Lancaster elite. And we've got doctors, we've got attorneys, we've got a lot of attorneys actually. They had Catholics, they had Jews, they had Protestants. It was a diverse, upper crust roster absolutely on purpose. Their first goal was to build a crematorium in Lancaster, but they also wanted to make cremation a thing in America more broadly. Hopefully, their influence would persuade some of the local folks to think that cremation wasn't all bad, and it would spread from there. According to the Modern Crematist in 1886, quote, "Intelligence, progress, and courage are the common and distinguishing characteristics of the members of the Lancaster Society." Basically, look at all these smart and successful people who like cremation. Clearly, this is the wave of the future. Also, the Modern Crematist was written by the society, so there's some self-congratulations happening here. So they got this crew together and immediately got to work building the crematorium. They bought 2.5 acres of land next to Greenwood Cemetery in June, hired a contractor in July, and got to work laying some bricks. One of their members designed a setup with 2 furnaces that could get temperatures up to 2,500 degrees, guaranteeing that everything in that chamber was going to get oxidized. On November 25th, 1884, they were finally ready to fire up the furnace. As the New York Times put it, after the dedication, the fires were started and the body of Mrs. Christiana Besler from New Jersey was reduced to ashes. The doors were shut and the body was slowly consumed. In a little over an hour's time, the remains were reduced to ashes and the fires were allowed to die out. Believe it or not, it gets even more metal after that, because prior to her death, her doctor pronounced the case a hopeless one. Mrs. Besler was told of this and requested to prepare for death. She said she did not fear death, but she made her husband promise that she would have her body reduced to ashes in a crematory and never placed in a cemetery. But wait, back up. The article says she died back in July, but she wasn't cremated until the end of November. What happened to her corpse in the 5 months in between? And this is my favorite part of the story. When Besler died in the summer of 1884, the Lancaster Crematorium was still under construction, and the only crematorium in the country was Lemoyne's estate. So her family sent her body on a train to western Pennsylvania. But Lemoyne's crematorium had just closed to the public, so they couldn't cremate her. Someone at Lemoyne's estate tried to get in touch with the Lancaster Society, but they had no way of taking her either. They basically replied, "Hey, we just broke ground on this project. Do you mind holding on to her for a few months?" The Lemoyne estate agreed to embalm the corpse, which would preserve the body long enough. Then in November, her body was sent on a train to Lancaster. This is all pre-refrigeration, mind you. All right, so let's go back to the opening ceremony. After the priest had finished leading prayer, a man named Dr. Miles L. Davis took the pulpit. This guy was a physician, but he was also the chairman of the building committee for the crematory. He was very invested in this building. And just like Lemoyne, he was a big fan of cremation for public health reasons. So he spent a few minutes of the ceremony talking about how great this building is going to be for public health. And with his speech, he gives us a great snapshot of the state of science in 1884. According to the Times, he mentions poisonous gases, which is a reference to the miasma model we were talking about earlier. He goes on to say that recent scientific discoveries have shown that the soil of the churchyards in which yellow fever victims have been interred is alive with microbian organisms. Which, yeah, that's how microscopes work. You'll find microbes everywhere if you look for them. But I shouldn't dunk on them too hard. Germ theory was starting to become the primary disease model over in Europe, but America was a decade or two late to the party. Team USA wouldn't get with the program until 1918, which more on that story here. But the piece follows it up with, "They are, it is said, exactly identical with those found in the vomit and blood of persons who had died of the dreaded disease." Now that is interesting. Unfortunately, the Times article doesn't reference who made that claim, and after spending an hour looking for anything that might be the original source, I couldn't find one. Either way, the conclusion conclusion is very clearly pro-cremation. There are germs in the soil, so they must have come from the burials. It's clear why Davis made sure to reference that study. To him and the other members of the society, they weren't just opening up a crematorium, they were ushering in a movement. The Reformed Society went on to publish a bunch of written material, including The Modern Crematist and a pamphlet in 1886. They also funded research to show that cremation was safe, since people were a little spooked that they were breathing corpse smoke coming from the crematorium's chimney. At one point, they published an experiment to show how crematory gas doesn't give off anything that pollutes the air. I mean, sure, they were burning coal, but that'll never come back to bite us, right? For a few years, it seemed like the society was onto something. Unfortunately, that initial interest in cremation tapered off. Nearby neighbors said that they could smell the fumes from the crematory chimney, which didn't sit right with them. Then, just 2 years after they opened, in 1886, Pope Leo XIII forbade Catholics from joining cremation societies or from cremating their own corpses. This ban wasn't lifted until Vatican II in 1963. The last cremation in Lancaster Crematorium took place in 1895, and the society disbanded in 1905. So what's the takeaway here? What can we learn from this story? To me, it's that death will always be as much of a cultural thing as it is a healthcare thing. Death is still a taboo topic. I think it goes like death, money, Fight Club, sex, Bruno, and politics in terms of things we don't talk about. But while cremation was really rare for most of the 20th century, it shot up in the 1960s and 70s, and now we're at the point where more than half of Americans got cremated in 2021. Culture and healthcare can change, but some revolutions happen in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Cremation Society of Lancaster served a legitimate purpose within healthcare, but they were 100 years late to the cremation revolution. Speaking of burials, did you know that almost every grave in San Francisco was dug up and moved to a nearby town? You can find a video about that story right here. Also, big thank you to my patrons who funded my trip from California to Pennsylvania. I've got more videos from that trip coming soon, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss them. Have fun, be good.